The deed hit the table in two pieces, and the silence that followed was the loudest thing Olive Baker had ever heard. Harlan Voss stood at the far end of the saloon's back room, his thick fingers splayed flat against the oak surface, his eyes dark with something that was not quite triumph but was close enough to make her stomach drop. The torn halves of the land deed lay between them like a wound, the ragged edge running directly through the most critical line, the surveyor's boundary notation, the official county seal, and the signature of the territorial land commissioner himself. Without those elements intact, the document was worthless. Without that document, Olive's 4 years of building, planting, and bleeding into that 160 acres of Kansas frontier soil meant nothing at all. "You see your problem," Harlan said, and it was not a question. He was a man who enjoyed watching people understand exactly how trapped they were. "Even if you had a complete deed, Miss Baker, a woman alone cannot hold title in Granger County, but you do not have a complete deed. You have 2 scraps of paper that a judge would laugh out of his courtroom." Beside her, she heard the sharp intake of breath from Ralph Doyle, the rancher who had ridden 40 miles in the dark to get her here in time, who had hammered on her door at 3 in the morning and said only, "Voss has moved. You need to come now." His jaw was tight. His hand had drifted toward the Colt at his hip, and she could feel the barely leashed fury radiating off him like heat from a forge. "Do not," she said quietly, and she did not even look at him when she said it. She was looking at the deed. Because Harlan Voss was wrong about one thing, and it was the only thing that mattered. He did not know what Olive Baker could do with a needle, a thread, and the particular knowledge she had spent her entire adult life accumulating. He did not know that she had spent 11 years repairing documents, garments, tapestries, and once, memorably, a hand-painted map that had been used as kindling by a careless soldier, restoring it so completely that 3 territorial judges had authenticated it as original. He did not know that the torn edge of that deed was not a death sentence. It was an invitation. She reached into the deep pocket of her work apron, the one she never removed even when riding, and her fingers closed around the small leather case that held her finest tools. "Give me 6 hours," she said. Ralph Doyle turned and stared at her with an expression she had never seen on his face before, and she had known him for going on 8 months. It was not disbelief. It was something deeper than that. It was the beginning of awe, but she was already pulling up a chair. 3 years before that night, Olive Baker had arrived in the town of Caldwell, Kansas, on a Thursday afternoon in the autumn of 1879, stepping off the Atchison, Topeka and Santa Fe Railroad with 2 trunks, a sewing box the size of a small valise, and absolutely no intention of asking anyone for help. She was 26 years old. She had red-brown hair that she pinned severely because it was practical, green eyes that tended to unsettle people when she looked at them directly and for too long, and hands that were at once the roughest and most precise instruments she had ever encountered on any human being. Her mother, God rest her, had said that Olive had been born with a needle in one hand and stubbornness in the other, and had spent 26 years trying to figure out which was more useful. Her mother had also told her to stay in Cincinnati. Olive had not stayed in Cincinnati. She had used the last of the small inheritance from her father, a cartographer who had died of fever in 1873, to purchase a homestead claim under the Homestead Act of 1862, 160 acres of shortgrass prairie 40 miles southwest of Caldwell, and she had done it under the only provision that allowed a woman to file. She was unmarried, she was the head of her own household, and she was 21 or older. The law had given her that much. What the law had not given her was any guarantee that the men who ran Granger County would honor it. She learned that slowly, the way you learn most things that matter, which is to say, one hard lesson at a time. The first lesson came from the land office clerk, a narrow-faced man named Desmond Pryor, who looked at her filing and then looked at her and said, with the particular smile of a man who considers himself generous when he is in fact being contemptible, that she might want to consider finding a husband before she wasted her money on a claim. Olive had looked at Desmond Pryor with her green eyes for a long moment, and then she had said, "I would like my receipt, please," and she had not smiled back. She built the claim herself for the first season, which meant she built a sod house, which meant she cut sod blocks from the prairie and stacked them until she had walls and a roof, which nearly broke her back but did not break her will. She dug a well. She planted a kitchen garden. She kept 2 chickens and a mule named Augustus who was temperamental but effective. And she set up her seamstress shop in the front room of the sod house, because that was how she would survive the first winter, because homesteading produced food and shelter but not ready coin, and coin was needed for seed and tools and lumber, and the 100 other things that a life on the frontier required. The people of the surrounding area came to her slowly at first, then steadily, because word travels fast on the prairie about a woman who can make a dress fit properly, who can repair a man's only good shirt so that the repair is invisible, who can rebind a worn Bible so that it looks almost new. They came because her work was extraordinary, and because her prices were fair, and because she did not gossip, which on the frontier was considered nearly as valuable as either of the first 2 things. She did not become rich, but she became solvent, and she became known. What she was not known as, to the people who counted themselves important in Granger County, was a landowner to be taken seriously. She was the seamstress. She was that woman out on the Baker claim, the one who managed to keep her place going year after year despite being alone, despite being female, despite doing it all without a husband or a brother or any male relation to stand beside her and give her respectability in the eyes of men like Harlan Voss. Harlan Voss was the largest landowner in Granger County. He had come to Kansas in the early 1870s with money already in his pocket and a talent for acquiring more, mostly by recognizing that land was the only real currency on the frontier, and that a man with enough of it could arrange circumstances so that smaller holders found themselves unable to hold on. He was not crude about it, usually. He was the kind of dangerous that wears a good suit and speaks in complete sentences, and can quote land law back at you while he is using it to take everything you have built. He had been trying to acquire the Baker claim for 2 of the 3 years Olive had been there, because her 160 acres sat between 2 larger parcels he already owned, and because the creek that ran through it in the northeastern corner was the most reliable water source for miles in any direction. Without her land, he had 2 large but separate properties. With it, he had a consolidated empire. She had turned down his first offer with a polite note. His second offer, which was lower despite pretending to be higher, she had turned down in person at the land office, with Desmond Pryor watching and looking nervous. His third approach had not been an offer at all, but a question about whether she had all her water rights documentation properly filed, which she had, because she had spent an entire evening reading the territorial statutes by lamplight until she understood exactly what was required, and then completed every form precisely. She was, in short, not a woman who made easy mistakes. Which was why, when Ralph Doyle first rode onto her property on a gray morning in February of 1882, she regarded him with the same careful assessment she gave to everything that arrived in her life without an explicit invitation. He was large. That was the first thing. Not tall in an angular, spare way, but broad and solid, with the particular build of a man who has done physical work since adolescence, and whose body has simply arranged itself accordingly. He had dark hair with dust in it from the road, and a jaw that suggested he had an opinion about most things, and generally kept it to himself. He was perhaps 30, or close to it, and he had the kind of face that was not conventionally handsome but was interesting, which Olive considered more valuable. He pulled up outside the sod house and called out, which was proper frontier courtesy, and she came to the door with her needle in her hand because she had been in the middle of a delicate repair on the town doctor's wife's best Sunday dress, and she did not intend to lose her place. "Miss Baker," he said. "That is me," she said. My name is Ralph Doyle. I run the Double D spread about 12 miles northeast of here. I understand you do repair work." She looked at him for a moment. "I do." "I have a situation," he said, and he sounded like a man who found it somewhat embarrassing to admit to a situation. "My sister Connie is getting married in 6 weeks. She has our mother's wedding dress. There was an accident with the trunk on the way from Missouri, and the dress it is bad, Miss Baker. 3 panels of the skirt are torn through, the bodice has water damage, and one sleeve is almost entirely detached." Olive stepped fully out the door and looked at him. "Did you bring it?" He reached behind him into his saddlebag and withdrew a carefully wrapped bundle, and he held it with the awkward reverence of a man who is handling something female and important and is very aware that he might be doing it wrong. She took it from him, unwrapped it, and looked at the dress for a long moment without speaking. It was a beautiful garment, or it had been. Ivory silk with ivory lace overlay, more than 20 years old by the look of the construction, and the damage was as bad as he had said. "Come back in 4 weeks, she said. He blinked. "You can fix it." She looked at him with her green eyes. "I said come back in 4 weeks. He came back in 3 weeks and 3 days because he was, as she would come to understand, constitutionally incapable of waiting for anything without performing at least one early check. The dress was done. She had not simply repaired it. She had restored it so completely that the torn panels showed no sign of damage. The water staining was gone through a painstaking process of careful wet cleaning, and blocking on a form she had improvised from a willow branch frame, and the detached sleeve was reattached at the shoulder seam in a way that was structurally stronger than the original construction. He stood in her front room and turned the dress slowly in his hands, and he was quiet for a long time. "This is not possible," he said finally. "It is quite possible," she said. "It is merely time-consuming and requires patience." He looked at her then, and it was the first time she noticed that his eyes were the particular gray of storm clouds before they opened up, and that he looked at her the way people look at things that surprise them in a way they were not prepared for. He paid her double what she asked without making any production of it, simply laid the bills on the table and said, "That is not enough for what you have done, but it is what I have with me." She could have been cool about it. She had been cool about most things for most of her life, because coolness was armor and armor was necessary. Instead, she said, "Your sister is going to be beautiful in it." And Ralph Doyle had smiled, and it had changed his face entirely, and Olive Baker had looked away first, which almost never happened. He found reasons to come back. That was how she thought of it privately in the early months. He found reasons. There was always something. A torn saddle blanket that required expert stitching. A canvas water bag that needed a reinforced seam. A woolen coat that had lost 3 buttons, which any frontier wife could have replaced but which he brought to her anyway and paid for, even though the buttons took her perhaps 8 minutes. She did not mind. This surprised her, because she was generally a woman who minded interruptions. He was not like the other men who came to the Baker claim with their barely concealed mixture of pity and proprietary condescension, the men who suggested she must find it terribly hard, being alone, who offered help in the particular way that was actually an offer of ownership. Ralph Doyle did not offer to help her. He talked to her. He asked about her work with what appeared to be genuine interest. He told her about his own operation, the Double D, with the same mixture of pride and pragmatic honesty that she brought to discussions of her own land, acknowledging both what was working and what was difficult. He had come to Kansas from Missouri 3 years before she had, he told her, with his younger sister Connie, and enough to buy a modest herd. He had built the Double D from that foundation through 4 years of relentless work. He had a crew of 4 men he trusted, a foreman named Pete Aldridge who was as loyal as a good dog and twice as competent, and a working partnership with 2 neighboring ranchers that gave them all collective leverage in market negotiations. He was, in short, a man who had built something real through his own effort, and who recognized the same quality in others. He never once suggested she would be better off with a husband. In April of 1882, he stayed for supper. This happened because she had made a pot of bean soup that was more than she would eat alone, and he happened to arrive at the end of the working day rather than the middle of it, and she had said without particularly thinking about it, "There is enough for two," and he had said, "I would be glad of it," and they had sat at her small table in the lamplight and talked for 3 hours. She told him about Cincinnati, about her father the cartographer, about the work of reading documents and textiles the way most people read faces, learning their language of construction and damage and possibility. She told him that she had known from the time she was 15 that she would not stay east, that she had always felt the pull of open country the way some people feel the pull of music, as something that lives in the body rather than just the mind. He told her about his father, who had died in the war, who had been a man of fierce principles and moderate luck. He told her about Missouri winters and the particular loneliness of building something with no one to build it for, and then he stopped, as if he had said more than he intended, and looked at his soup, and she had very carefully not pursued it. But she thought about it later, in the dark, listening to the wind work across the prairie. She had been alone by choice and by circumstance both, and she had made peace with it mostly. She had built her life with precision and intention. She did not need saving. She did not need managing. She did not need anyone to believe in her, because she believed in herself with a thoroughness that left no room for doubt to take root. What she had not accounted for was the possibility of someone who simply wanted to sit across a table from her and be in the same room. May brought warming weather and brought Connie Doyle's wedding, at which Olive appeared as a guest, at Connie's personal and enthusiastic insistence, and watched the young woman walk down the aisle of Caldwell's Methodist Church in the restored ivory dress, beautiful and glowing with happiness, and felt something clench warmly in her chest. Ralph was standing near the back of the church with his hat in his hands, and when Olive came in he moved slightly, making a small space, and she stood beside him, and they watched his sister get married, and his arm was close enough to hers that she could feel the warmth of him through the fabric. He did not take her hand. He did not do anything at all. But when it was over and they were outside in the bright May sunshine, he turned to her and said, "I am glad you were here," in a voice that was quiet and meant. "So am I," she said. June was when things began to shift beneath the surface, though she did not know all of it until much later. Harlan Voss made his third attempt to buy the Baker claim in the first week of June, and when she declined in writing as she had the previous times, something changed in his approach. She did not notice it immediately. The frontier was full of small pressures, small inconveniences, things that might have been coincidence or might have been deliberate, and you learned to assess them carefully before drawing conclusions. The water in her well began to run turbid in the second week of June. She tested it, found nothing biological but noted that something upstream had disturbed the aquifer, and dug a second well, which was backbreaking work but within her capability. A week later, Desmond Pryor sent her a letter notifying her that there was a question about the original survey of her claim boundaries, and that a resurvey might be required, and that until it was completed the status of her claim was technically uncertain. She read this letter 3 times, very carefully, and then she put it in the small iron box she kept under her bed with her important documents, and she rode to Caldwell. She went first to the land office and asked Desmond Pryor, with great courtesy and considerable precision, exactly which portion of her survey documentation was in question, and exactly what statute governed the resurvey process, and exactly what, technically uncertain, meant in legal terms as it applied to an existing homestead claim. Desmond Pryor sweated and stammered and finally admitted that the letter had been sent at the request of Harlan Voss, who had raised an informal query, and that there was no official proceeding. Not yet. She thanked him and left, and went directly to the office of the only attorney in Caldwell, a man named Carter Fitch who was competent enough but overwhelmed, and she paid him $50. She could not particularly afford to review her claim documentation and confirm that it was in order. It was in order. She paid Carter Fitch for his time and went home, and that evening she took all of her documents out of the iron box and read through them again, from the original filing through every annual filing, every receipt, every surveyor's report, and she understood two things. First, that her claim was solid. Second, that solid documentation was only useful if the documentation survived. She was a woman who thought about preservation. She made 2 copies of every critical document by hand in her best and most precise writing. She sent one set to Carter Fitch's office and paid him to keep it locked. The other she sealed in oilcloth and buried in a location she marked only in her memory. She told no one about this, not yet. She told Ralph Doyle about it 6 weeks later, on a July evening when the heat had finally broken, and they were sitting on her small front step, watching the sunset go extravagant and orange over the shortgrass, and he had ridden over for no stated reason at all, which they had both stopped pretending required a reason. He listened without interrupting, which was one of the things about him that she had come to value enormously, the way he could be entirely still and entirely attentive at once. When she finished, he was quiet for a moment, and then he said, "Voss is not going to stop." "I know," she said. "He has done this before," Ralph said, "to a man named Birch who had a claim on the other side of the county, the kind of pressure that looks like nothing from the outside. Paperwork complications, neighbor disputes, water problems. He does it until people are tired or scared or broke. He does not know," she said carefully, "who he is dealing with." Ralph turned and looked at her in the fading light, and she saw something in his face that she would remember for a long time, a kind of frank and open recognition, like a man identifying something he had been looking for without knowing he was looking. "No," he said quietly, "I do not think he does." They sat in the cooling evening air for another hour, talking about practical matters and other matters entirely, and when he finally rose to go, he stood for a moment looking down at her, and she tilted her head back to look up at him, and neither of them said what was right there on the surface of everything between them. "I will ride by more often," he said, "if you do not mind." "I do not mind," she said. He rode away into the dark, and she stayed on the step a while longer, feeling the warmth of the cooling night and the complicated warmth of something else entirely. August brought Harlan Voss to her door in person, which she had been expecting and for which she was prepared. He was a large man, heavyset, with a carefully trimmed beard and the clothes of a man who wants you to notice he can afford good clothes. He had with him a lawyer from Wichita, which was meant to be intimidating, and a new offer for her land, which was 15% above the previous one. Olive made them both coffee, because she was not uncivil, and she sat across from them at her table, and listened to the offer presented with all of the Wichita lawyer's considerable ornamental language, and then she said, "No." The Wichita lawyer looked at her the way the Wichita lawyers of 1882 tended to look at lone female homesteaders, which was to say with the particular expression of a man who believes the problem before him is a failure of understanding rather than a failure of his offer. He began again more slowly. She interrupted him, which she rarely did and which was therefore effective. "Mr. Voss," she said, "I am aware of what you have done with the informal query to the land office regarding my survey. I am aware that the turbidity in my well in June was not natural. I have documentation of both. I have also retained legal counsel and duplicated all of my claim documentation with a third party. This land is mine by law and by 4 years of my own labor. It is not for sale at any price. And if any further effort is made to compromise my water supply, my documentation, or my claim in any way, I will file a formal complaint with the Territorial Land Commissioner's office in Topeka, and I will make it very detailed." Harlan Voss stared at her. His Wichita lawyer was very still. "You have done your research," Harlan said finally. "I always do," she said. They left, And Harlan Voss walked to his horse and looked back at her once, standing in her doorway, and his expression was not the expression of a man who has accepted defeat. It was the expression of a man who is rearranging his approach. She told Ralph about the visit 2 days later, and he listened with the controlled tension of a man who wants very badly to ride to Harlan Voss's property and have a different kind of conversation about the matter, but who respects the woman in front of him enough not to do anything she has not asked him to do. "You handled it exactly right," he said. "I know," she said without arrogance, simply with the assurance of a woman who had prepared carefully and executed precisely. He laughed, and it was such an open and genuine sound that it startled both of them slightly, and she smiled, which startled her more because she did not often smile without meaning it deeply. "Miss Baker," he said, and there was something in his voice that was different from anything she had heard in it before. "You can call me Olive," she said. "I think we have known each other long enough." "Olive," he said, and it sounded like something being settled. "I would like to call on you properly, if that is something you would consider." She looked at him for a long moment. "I consider it," she said. "I would like that, Ralph." So he called on her properly, which on the frontier of 1882 was a different affair from calling on a woman in Cincinnati, but was no less meaningful. He came twice a week when the season allowed, and they went on a long ride through the late August prairie, side by side on their horses, and they talked the whole way, the kind of talking that is really a long process of becoming known to another person, and she found that being known by him was not frightening the way it had always previously seemed that being known would be. September was golden and full of harvest work, and he helped her bring in her kitchen garden, which he did competently and without condescension, doing the work she directed without suggesting he knew better, and she made apple preserves and stored them against the winter and gave him 2 jars to take home, and the way he took them, carefully, as if they were something precious, made her feel something she had no word for and did not try to name. He kissed her for the first time in October, on an afternoon of cold wind and low golden light, standing outside her barn after they had brought in her single milk cow before a weather turn. He had turned to say something and found her already turned toward him, and they had both stopped, and then he had lifted his hand and touched her face very gently, as if asking, and she had answered by being very still and present, and it was a careful, serious kiss, the kind that means more than the ones that come easier. She had thought about how she felt about it afterward, alone that evening, with the particular honest attention she brought to everything important. She was in love with him. She had been moving toward it for months, and now she had arrived, and it was both larger and simpler than she had expected. She loved his steadiness and his humor and the way he listened. She loved that he had never once tried to manage her or minimize her or treat the life she had built as a problem to be solved. She loved that he was surprised by her, repeatedly, and that his surprise was always delight rather than discomfort. She was also aware, with the clear-eyed practicality that was as much a part of her as her heartbeat, that loving someone and building a life with someone were 2 different propositions, and that she would need to understand very clearly whether the second was possible before she put her whole heart into the first. But she already had put her whole heart in. She was honest enough to know it. November was when Harlan Voss found the hidden angle. He could not shake her documentation. He could not intimidate her out. He could not manufacture enough legal complications to wear her down. What he could do, and what he did, was find a man who had once worked as a junior clerk in the Territorial Land Commissioner's office, who had access to certain records and was willing, for a price, to make a subtle and technical alteration to the county land record book. Not to her deed itself, to the record. The alteration was sophisticated. It moved the recorded date of her original filing by 2 days, which under the particular filing priority statute for overlapping claims meant that a competing claim filed on the actual date of her filing would have legal priority over hers. Conveniently, Harlan Voss had filed exactly such a competing claim on what was now, according to the altered record, the prior date. She did not find out about it until December, when a formal notice arrived from the county land office informing her that her claim was subject to a priority dispute under territorial statute, and that a hearing had been scheduled for January 15, 1883, at which both parties would present documentation. She read the notice twice. Then she went to the iron box and took out her original deed. She already knew something was wrong before she looked at the deed, because she knew the original filing date. She had memorized it years ago, and the date in the notice was 2 days off. But when she looked at the deed itself was fine. The date on her original deed was correct. The problem was the county record, and she could not override the county record with only her deed, because the county record was what the judge would consult first. And the county record had been changed. She rode to Caldwell in the cold. She went to the land office and asked to see the county land record book. Desmond Pryor showed it to her, looking sweaty and unable to meet her eyes, which told her something useful. The entry for her claim had been altered. She could see it, or rather she could feel it, with the particular sensitivity she had developed over years of working with documents, a slight unevenness in the ink, a very small inconsistency in the letter formations compared to the original surrounding entries. She asked Desmond Pryor if she could borrow the county record book to have it reviewed. He told her he could not allow that. She went back out into the cold and stood in the street and thought very carefully. Then she rode to Ralph's. He was in the barn when she arrived, and he came out when he heard hooves, and he took one look at her face and said, "Tell me," she told him, "all of it. The altered record, the competing claim, the hearing date, the specific nature of the fraud." She told it quickly and precisely, the way she always communicated things that mattered, without emotional decoration but without omission. When she finished, he was quiet for a moment, and then he said, "We need to get you that record book." "I know," she said. "I have a thought about how." What she needed was access to the county record book long enough to examine it properly, in the right light with her tools, to document the alteration in a way that could be presented as evidence. The book could not leave the land office, but the land office was unmanned between the hours of 5 in the evening and 8 in the morning. "I cannot ask you to do this," she said. "It is not legal." "You are not asking me," Ralph said. "I am telling you I am going to help you." She looked at him for a long moment. "I need to be the one who examines it. You would be there only to manage any complications." "I understand," he said. "And I need to do it tonight, because the longer we wait, the more chance Voss has to further complicate things." He was already reaching for his coat. They rode to Caldwell in the dark, arriving well after the town had gone quiet. The land office was a small frame building on the main street, and the lock on the back window was of the simple kind that yielded to a small piece of bent wire, and Olive had it open in under a minute while Ralph stood watch in the alley. She worked by the light of a small shielded lantern, no bigger than her fist, keeping the beam narrow and low. She found the county record book in the second drawer of the main cabinet, exactly where she had seen Desmond Pryor retrieve it. She carried it to the desk and opened it to the entry for the Baker claim. She took from her apron pocket her magnifying lens, the small one she used for fine needlework, and she bent close. The alteration was more sophisticated than she had initially assessed from memory, but it was there. The ink had been applied over the original entry in a way that suggested chemical lightening of the original and then reinscription, a technique she recognized, because she had used something similar in document restoration work. The letter formation in the altered date was subtly different from the clerk's hand in the surrounding entries. The ink was marginally lighter in tone. She could not remove the alteration. She could not restore the book to its original state without time and tools she did not have here, and tampering with the county record would make her own position worse rather than better. What she could do was prove it had been tampered with. She worked for an hour in the narrow lamplight, making precise notes on everything she observed. The ink tone differential, the letter formation inconsistencies, the chemical trace at the edges of the altered entry, the specific way the date numbers had been formed as compared to the same numbers elsewhere in the same clerk's hand in entries she could confirm were original. She sketched the entry twice, annotated with measurements. She made notes that would stand as technical evidence of her professional assessment. Then she put the book away, exactly as she had found it, and they left. In the alley outside, Ralph took the lantern from her and shielded it, and in the dark she felt his hand find hers for just a moment, a brief, strong grip that was part gratitude and part something far more personal. And then they were walking back to their horses, and neither of them said anything about what it had meant, but it had meant everything. January was cold and relentless, and the hearing date of the 15th approached with the particular weight of a deadline that has real consequences. Carter Fitch, her attorney, reviewed her notes and her analysis of the altered record book and was cautiously optimistic, but cautious primarily. "Your analysis is compelling," he said. "But a judge who favors Voss, or who is simply skeptical of expert testimony from a woman who is not an official document examiner, may not find it sufficient." "I understand," she said. "What would be sufficient," Carter said, "would be the original deed alongside a corroborated expert opinion. Your deed is intact, yes, both pieces." She had not told Carter about the deed because until this moment the deed itself had not been in question. "My deed is complete," she said. "I have it at home." She rode home that evening with the particular alertness of someone who has been told that the thing she was certain was secure is now the most important thing she possesses. She went to the iron box and took out the deed. She had been wrong that the deed was intact. She had not been wrong when she last examined it in June, but something had happened between June and now. The deed was in two pieces. She stood in her kitchen with her lantern held close and looked at the torn document with the sharp, focused attention of a woman who does not permit herself to panic, who assesses rather than reacts, who understands that emotion is data, but that data is more useful than panic. The deed had been cut. Not torn in handling, not damaged by water or age, but deliberately and carefully cut with a fine blade through the most critical section of the document: the surveyor's boundary notation, the county seal impression, and the commissioner's signature. Someone had been in her house. She looked around. Nothing else was displaced. It was a careful, targeted intrusion, a professional act, someone who knew what they were doing and knew exactly what to take and precisely how to damage it. She sat down at her table and placed both halves of the deed in front of her and looked at them for a long time. Then she began to think. The cut was clean. The two halves were both present, which meant the intruder had not taken anything but had damaged. The damage was to the authentication elements: the seal, the signature, the boundary text. Without these legible and intact, a judge would not be able to authenticate the deed as the original filing document. But the cut, however clean, was still a cut. The paper was still there. Both halves were still there. And paper, like fabric, like anything made with structure and intention, could sometimes be repaired. This was not a standard repair. She had never repaired a legal document in this particular way, though she had come as close as the hand-painted map she had restored years ago in Cincinnati. That work had taken her the better part of a month. She had less than 2 weeks. She began that night. She worked at her table by lamplight, her finest tools laid out with the precision of a surgeon preparing for an operation. She had pure linen thread, finer than human hair, the kind she used for the most delicate lace repairs. She had a solution she mixed herself from a formula she had developed for the map restoration, a combination of rice paste and a carefully proportioned amount of a substance that, when applied to the cut edges of paper and allowed to cure slowly, would draw them together and bond them to the molecular degree. She had her magnifying lens. She had her steadiest hands and her most absolute patience. The work was extraordinarily difficult. Paper is not fabric. It does not yield to a needle the same way. The linen thread had to be drawn through the two halves along the cut line in a technique she had called, to herself, the ghost stitch, because the thread was almost invisible against the pale document stock, and its function was not to hold the pieces together visually, but to provide structural support for the adhesive beneath. She worked 4 hours the first night before her eyes gave out. She worked 5 hours the second night. She worked 6 on the third. And by the end of the third night, the adhesive was curing, and the two halves were drawn together with a contact so close that, when she held it to the lamp, the join was only visible when the light struck it at a particular angle. But the seal and the signature remained partially obscured by the cut line. The thread and adhesive drew the physical paper together, but the impression of the seal and the ink of the signature were interrupted at the tear. She had one more technique. She had in her kit a set of fine brush tools she used for color restoration in damaged textile work. Mixed pigments matched to the original tones. She had used them on the map to restore areas where the original ink had flaked. She could not forge the seal or the signature, because that would itself be fraud, but she could, with extraordinary care, restore the portions of both that had been physically present in the paper, and had been disrupted only by the physical separation of the cut, drawing them back together by guiding the remaining ink residue to close continuity. This was the most delicate work she had ever done. She finished it at 4 in the morning on January 13th, 2 days before the hearing, by which time she had not slept more than 3 hours in any single night for 10 days, and her hands were shaking from tension rather than uncertainty, and the deed lay on her table under the lamplight, whole. She held her magnifying lens over it for a long time. The join was there, if you knew what to look for and held the light at exactly the right angle, a slight unevenness in the paper surface along the repair line, but the seal was complete. The signature was uninterrupted. The boundary text read clearly end to end. She set down the lens. She pressed both hands flat on the table and breathed. Then she took out paper and a pen and wrote Ralph Doyle a letter which she paid a boy in Caldwell to carry at first light the next morning, and the letter said simply, "I have it. I need you to ride with me to the hearing. Please come in the morning." He was at her door before 7. She opened it before he knocked because she had heard his horse on the road a quarter-mile out, and she held the deed out to him in both hands before he had even fully crossed the threshold. He took it. He looked at it. He turned it over, looked at the back, brought it to the light from the window, and then he went very still. He looked at her. "Olive," he said, and his voice was low and strange and full. "It is sound," she said. "I can document the repair process and establish that it is the original document. Carter Fitch will present my professional analysis alongside it." Ralph looked at the deed again. He looked at the repair line that was only just barely visible in the window light. Looked at the restored seal, the complete signature, the uninterrupted boundary text. His face was doing something complicated and large. "When did you do this?" he said. "The past 10 days. 10 Olive." He stopped. He seemed to be looking for words and finding that the usual ones were not sufficient. "I have seen a lot of things in my life," he said, "that I thought could not be done. I have never seen this is—" He stopped again. "It works," she said simply. "It is extraordinary," he said. He said it plainly, the way he said everything that mattered to him, without ornamentation, and it landed with the weight of something that meant a great deal more than the 2 words on their surface. "You are extraordinary." She felt color come into her face, which almost never happened. "Let us go win the hearing," she said. They rode into Caldwell together on the morning of January 15th, 1883, in the cold, and the courtroom, which was the back room of the largest saloon, was already crowded when they arrived because word had gotten out that the Baker claim dispute was being heard, and people came to hearings the way they came to everything on the frontier, as the particular combination of civic function and entertainment that broke up the long, quiet work of daily life. Harlan Voss was already there, with his Wichita lawyer and 2 other men who radiated the quiet authority of men hired to suggest that their employer's position is unassailable. He looked at Olive when she came in and then looked at Ralph, and something shifted slightly in the calculation behind his eyes. Judge Merritt was a man of 60 who had been on the frontier bench for 20 years and had seen most of what it had to offer and was largely unimpressible, which was exactly what Olive wanted in a judge. Harlan Voss's lawyer presented first, with considerable polish. He presented the altered county record book as evidence of filing priority. He presented Voss's competing claim. He presented an argument that was structurally sound on its face and would have been completely convincing if the foundation under it had not been rotten. Carter Fitch presented second. He presented Olive's deed. He presented her 10-page documented analysis of the county record book alteration, written in the kind of precise technical language that was difficult to dismiss because it was too specific to hand-wave away. He called Olive herself to speak, and she stood before Judge Merritt in a room full of skeptical and curious and occasionally hostile faces, and she explained what she had found in the land office record book with the same clarity and precision she brought to everything, and she answered every challenge from Voss's lawyer with quiet, exact specificity. When Voss's lawyer suggested that a seamstress was not qualified to render opinions on document evidence, she looked at him with her green eyes and said, "I have restored damaged documents in 3 states over 11 years. I have provided expert assessments for 2 territorial courts and 1 federal land dispute. I am presenting physical evidence of specific, observable, and measurable anomalies in the county record. The judge may weigh my qualifications as he sees fit." Judge Merritt had been watching her throughout with the stillness of a man paying very close attention. "The document," the judge said. "Let me see the deed." Carter Fitch passed it up. The judge examined it for a long time. He was an old man who had held a lot of documents, and he held this one carefully, turning it in the light. "There is a repair here," he said. "Yes, Your Honor," Olive said. "The document was deliberately cut in an intrusion on my property prior to this hearing. I repaired it. I can provide a full technical account of the repair, which will demonstrate that the underlying document is original and unaltered." The judge looked at her over the deed. "You repaired it yourself?" "Yes, Your Honor." "What is your method?" she told him. Precisely and completely, including the materials, the technique, the source of her methodology, and the way in which her repair could be distinguished from the original construction and verified as non-falsifying. She had been prepared for this question because she had known it would come. The courtroom was very quiet. Then the judge looked at the deed again for a long moment, and he looked at Harlan Voss, and he said, "Mr. Voss, I would like your attorney to explain to me, in the context of the very specific anomalies described by Miss Baker regarding the county record book, how the alteration she has identified is not an alteration." Voss's lawyer began to speak, and the judge listened, and it was apparent within approximately 2 minutes that the explanation was inadequate, because Olive's analysis had been too precise, too technically detailed, and too specifically verifiable for a general denial to hold. The hearing took 4 hours. At the end of it, Judge Merritt ruled that the county record book entry was subject to a formal investigation by the Territorial Land Commissioner's Office, that the competing claim filed by Harlan Voss was suspended pending that investigation, and that the Baker claim stood on the basis of the original deed and the original filing documentation, which had been presented and was accepted as authentic. Harlan Voss left the courtroom without speaking. His face was absolutely controlled, the face of a man who has played a hand and lost it, and who is already thinking about the next hand, but there was something different in it from the previous assessment and recalculation. Something that looked like it might become, given enough time, a form of genuine concession. He would commission no further interference. This, Olive would only learn later from a conversation between Desmond Pryor and Carter Fitch, which Pryor had apparently precipitated out of a combination of guilt and self-preservation once the scope of the county record alteration came under official investigation. Voss had decided that the Baker claim was more trouble than the land was worth, now that his methods were documented and a formal investigation was underway, and he had quietly withdrawn from the field. The creek that ran through the northeastern corner of her 160 acres would remain hers. Outside the saloon in the cold January air, Caldwell's Main Street shone with the particular brightness of winter sun on packed snow, and Olive stood breathing it in, feeling the relief move through her in long, slow waves. Ralph came to stand beside her. He had not said much during the hearing, but he had been there, a solid and deliberate presence at her back throughout, and she had felt it the way you feel something you can rely on, something structural, something that holds. "It is done," he said. "It is done," she agreed. He was quiet for a moment, and then he said, "Olive." And when she turned to look at him, his expression was the one she had first seen in her kitchen on a gray February morning, when he had held his mother's restored dress and could not quite find the language for what he was feeling. Only it was larger now, much larger. "I have been trying to find the right moment to say something to you for a long time," he said. "I think I kept waiting for things to settle down, and I have come to understand that things may not settle down, and that a right moment is something you make rather than find." "Yes," she said. "I love you," he said, simply and directly, the way he said everything that he meant completely. "I have loved you since at least September, and probably since the morning I brought you my mother's ruined dress, and you looked at it and said come back in 4 weeks like it was the most certain thing in the world. I have never known anyone like you, Olive. You are remarkable and fierce, and you know things that I had no idea were knowable, and you do not wait for anyone's permission to do what you are capable of doing. I would like very much to ask whether you would consider building something with me, not because you need me. I know you do not need me, but because I believe we would build something extraordinary together." Olive looked at him. The winter sun was in her eyes, and his face was very clear and very open, and she thought about the word extraordinary, which he had used twice now, and about what it meant to be known by someone in the particular way that this man knew her, which was to say seen completely and valued entirely, which was the rarest and most important kind of being known. "I love you," she said. "I have for months. I did not want to be precipitous." He laughed, and it startled a couple of passers-by, and she laughed too, and he reached out and took her hand and held it, right there on the main street of Caldwell, Kansas, in January of 1883, in broad daylight, and neither of them cared at all who saw. They did not rush. This was the particular wisdom of two people who had each built something real by themselves and knew the value of building things properly. They spent the winter calling on each other regularly, formally still in the public sense, but privately with the kind of deep ease that comes when two people have already done the hard work of knowing each other before they said the most important words. She told him everything she had not yet told him. The full scope of her document restoration work in Cincinnati, the career she had left behind and had never stopped practicing, the way she had understood from the beginning that her seamstress reputation on the frontier was an incomplete picture that people chose to take as the whole picture, and how she had never corrected this assumption, because she had found that being underestimated was sometimes the most useful position available. He told her everything he had not yet told her. The 2 hard years after Missouri when he had wondered if he was building toward anything. The way his sister's happiness had clarified something for him about what he wanted. The specific night in February when he had ridden home from her claim and had understood that he was in profound trouble in the best possible way. In March, he asked her to marry him. He did it on a Wednesday afternoon in her kitchen, while she was in the middle of a tricky repair on a child's christening gown, and she later reflected that she was glad he had not waited for a scenic or dramatic moment, because a Wednesday afternoon in her kitchen was as real and as much hers as anything in her life, and it was fitting that this happened there. She said yes. They were married in April, 1 year after she had watched his sister walk down the church aisle in the restored ivory dress. The ceremony was in the Caldwell Methodist Church, which was small and plain and entirely adequate, and Connie Doyle, now Connie Marsh, wept the way only a younger sister can weep at a wedding, which is to say completely and joyfully, and without any self-consciousness. The question of where they would live was one they had discussed at length, with the practicality that characterized everything important they worked out together. The Baker claim was her land and she had fought for it, and it was not going to be left behind. The Doubleday was his livelihood, and it was not going to be abandoned. After considerable discussion and several sketches made on the backs of bills of lading, they decided that the Baker claim would remain as a separate property under her name, as the law now permitted in Kansas, while they built a new house on a parcel between her claim and the Doubleday that connected the two operations in a way that made practical and economic sense. Ralph's foreman Pete Aldridge, who was a taciturn man of considerable good sense, said only, "Good," when told about the arrangement, which from Pete was an effusion of enthusiasm. The new house went up in the summer of 1883, built with hired labor and with Ralph's considerable personal participation, and with Olive's precise involvement in every structural decision, because she had opinions about construction based on 4 years of building and maintaining a sod house, and she was not going to have windows in the wrong place. She kept her seamstress work. This had never been in question. It was hers, and it was part of who she was, and Ralph understood this not as a concession, but as a fact of who he had married, and he was proud of it in a particular and quiet way that she found far more meaningful than any louder expression would have been. The territorial investigation into the county land record book alteration concluded in the autumn of 1883. The former territorial land office clerk who had made the alteration, a man named George Cassidy who had no relation to anyone famous, was charged under territorial statute with falsification of official records. Harlan Voss was investigated but not charged, as the connection between him and Cassidy, while strongly suggested by circumstantial evidence, could not be definitively established in the legal sense. This was frustrating. Olive sat with this frustration for a while, turned it over, and concluded that the important outcome had been secured. Her land was untouchable, Voss had withdrawn, and the official record had been corrected. The creek ran where it always had run. The shortgrass prairie stood in its autumn gold. She could live with imperfect justice. She had always known that imperfect justice was the kind most readily available on the frontier, and that the alternative to accepting it was spending the rest of your life angry about it, which was a waste of both time and energy. What she could not have anticipated, and what happened anyway, was that Harlan Voss sent her a letter in November of 1883. It was brief. It said that he had reviewed her analysis of the county record book, which had been entered into the official investigation file and which he had obtained a copy of, and that he had not previously been aware of the specific methods involved or of her professional background. He said that he had a property in Wichita, a commercial building whose deed had been damaged in a fire, and that he was prepared to pay a significant sum for professional restoration of the document. He said he would understand if she declined. She read the letter twice. Then she showed it to Ralph, who read it once and then set it on the table and looked at her. "What do you want to do?" he said. "What I think," she said slowly, "is that this is a man who respects demonstrated competence above most other things, and who has recently had it demonstrated to him in a manner he could not dismiss, and that this is also a man who has more land and more influence in this county than anyone else, and who could make future dealings easier or harder depending on how he chooses to regard us." "Also true," Ralph said. "It is not forgiveness," she said. "I have not forgiven him and do not particularly intend to, but it is business," she wrote back. She quoted her professional rate for document restoration, which was the rate she charged in Cincinnati and which was very comfortable, and she said she would review the Wichita deed and assess whether restoration was possible before committing to a timeline. Harlan Voss paid her rate without negotiation. She restored the Wichita deed. It took 6 weeks and was technically interesting if not emotionally compelling, and when she delivered it, she and Voss had a conversation that was professional throughout and entirely civil. And he shook her hand at the end of it and said she had done excellent work. And she thanked him and left, and did not particularly feel the need to have any further interaction with him beyond what business required. Ralph found the whole thing both absurd and impressive, and he was not wrong on either count. The winter of 1883 to 1884 was the first winter Olive had spent not entirely alone since she had come to Kansas, and the difference was something she had not fully anticipated because she had not permitted herself to fully imagine it. It was not the practical difference, though the practical difference was real enough. Two sets of hands and two minds applied to the steady work of keeping a household and two properties running through the cold months. It was the particular warmth of being in a house with another person at the end of the day, of having someone to talk to in the evenings, of waking in the night to the sound of another person's breathing. She did not need it. She had established conclusively, over 4 years on her own, that she did not need it. But she found, to her careful and genuine surprise, that not needing something and deeply wanting it were not mutually exclusive, and that having what you want, when you have built it on the foundation of what you have always needed and provided for yourself, is a different and more extraordinary thing than having it any other way. She told Ralph this one evening in February in approximately those words, and he had looked at her with those storm-gray eyes and said, "I think about that often, about the difference between wanting something and needing it. I needed Connie to be all right. I wanted her to be happy. I needed the Doubledy to succeed. I wanted to build something that would last beyond me. I needed to—" He stopped and started again. "I needed a lot of things that the work provided. But you are the want, Olive. You are the thing I had no idea I was moving toward." She had no words for the thing this produced in her, so she did not try to find them, but she reached across the table and took his hand, and they sat in the lamplight of the house they had built together with the winter wind against the walls and the stove warm at the center of the room, and it was everything. In late spring of 1884, she told him she was expecting a child. He was in the middle of cleaning a bridle when she said it, and he stopped and put the bridle down very carefully, as if it had become suddenly fragile, and turned to look at her with an expression that was so entirely unguarded that it made her chest ache in the best possible way. "Are you well?" he said first. "Very well," she said. He crossed the room and put his arms around her, and held her with the particular gentleness of a man who is very aware of the difference between strength as protection and strength as pressure. And she pressed her face against his shoulder and felt, with complete and overwhelming clarity, that she was entirely home. Their son was born in the autumn of 1884, on a clear September morning when the shortgrass had gone its particular gold, and the sky was the particular impossible blue that Kansas produced in September as if in apology for the previous months. They named him James, after Ralph's father, and he arrived in the world with great indignation and a quantity of dark hair and hands that Olive immediately examined with the attention of a professional and pronounced structurally excellent. Connie came from Laramie, where she and her husband Henry had moved in the spring, and she held her nephew with the reverence of someone holding something miraculous, and she told Olive, with characteristic Doyle directness, that the baby was perfect and that she fully intended to be an involved aunt whether or not that was convenient. Pete Aldridge, presented with the infant, looked at him for a long time and then said, "Good," which remained his signature utterance and was no less meaningful for its brevity. Life on the Baker Doyle properties, as people in the county had taken to calling the combined operation, found a rhythm that was both demanding and deeply satisfying. The Doubledy expanded its herd over the next 2 years. Olive's claim, now formally folded into the larger operations management but retained under her legal title as she had insisted, provided the creek-fed pasture that made the expansion possible. Her seamstress and document restoration work continued, generating enough additional income to fund the improvements to the new house and a proper barn, and generating enough regional reputation that she was twice consulted by courts in the county seat on document evidence matters, which she found genuinely interesting. She was not a woman who did only one thing. She had never been. In the summer of 1886, she and Ralph rode the boundary of the Baker claim together on a Saturday afternoon, just the two of them, the way they had first ridden the prairie together 4 years before. James was at the house with the young woman who came 3 days a week to help with the domestic work, and the day was hot and still and full of grasshoppers in the shortgrass. They rode the whole perimeter of the 160 acres, which took the better part of 2 hours, and at the northeastern corner, where the creek ran cold and steady over its gravel bed, they stopped and let the horses drink. "I remember," Ralph said, "the first time you told me about this creek. You said it was the most valuable thing on the property." "It is," she said. "I did not understand that then," he said. "Not completely. I thought it was practical. Water on the frontier, yes. But I did not understand the way you understood it, that this specific water in this specific place was the key to everything, to your independence, to the whole life you had built." She looked at the creek, at the light on the water. "Did you understand it later?" she asked. "I understood it when you told me you had repaired the deed," he said. "When you handed it to me and I held it and I saw what you had done. I understood then that you had seen the full shape of what you were defending and that you had done something. Olive, I have turned it over in my mind for 3 years. What you did. The 10 nights with a needle and a lens and a lamp alone, not asking for help, doing the hardest possible thing with the greatest possible precision because that is simply how you operate. It changed how I think about most things." She looked at him. "Including me. It confirmed everything I already knew about you," he said. "Which is that you are the most capable and remarkable person I have ever known, and that I am very fortunate to love you." She reached across the small space between the horses and put her hand against his face, and he turned into it, and they sat there at the northeastern corner of the Baker claim, with the creek running cold and the sun on the short grass, and the full weight of everything they had built and survived and chosen, all of it present and real and continuing. In the spring of 1887, their second child arrived, a daughter this time, whom they named Clara, and who came into the world with the same excellent hands and the particular focused expression of a person who intends to understand her environment thoroughly, which Ralph said looked familiar and Olive took as the highest possible compliment. The county had changed in the years since the hearing. Granger County was filling in, new homesteaders arriving with each season, the small town of Caldwell growing into something that required more services and more institutions. A new schoolhouse was built, a proper church, not just a converted saloon back room. A bank which made everyone's commercial dealings simpler, and which Ralph regarded with the healthy skepticism of a man who had managed without one for a long time, but understood the practical necessity. Desmond Pryor resigned from the land office after the official investigation concluded, more by mutual agreement than by personal choice, and his replacement was a woman named Harriet Branch, who had come from a law office in Topeka, and who ran the land office with a precision and accountability that made Olive deeply satisfied every time she had cause to visit it. Harlan Voss eventually sold most of his Granger County holdings in 1888 and moved his operations to Colorado, where he presumably began the whole process again with different terrain and different neighbors. This was not justice, but it was distance, and distance was not nothing. Carter Fitch's law practice expanded significantly, partly on the strength of his involvement in the Baker claim case, which had acquired a certain regional reputation as an example of successful defense against improper land manipulation. He hired a junior associate in 1886 and a second one in 1889, and he sometimes brought particularly complex document questions to Olive, which she handled at her professional rate and which she genuinely enjoyed. She was, by the late 1880s, a woman of recognized standing in Granger County, which she had earned in the old-fashioned way, by being good at what she did and by being unintimidated by anyone who suggested she should be otherwise. People spoke of her professional opinions with the respect you extend to expertise that has been proven under pressure. The story of the hearing, of the deed, of the 10 nights alone with her tools, had entered the county's collective memory as one of those stories that survives because it contains something true about what people are capable of when they refuse to accept the assessment of those who have underestimated them. She did not spend much time thinking about the story as a story. She was busy. She had 2 children and a husband and 160 acres, and a practice and an expanding network of professional connections. And the days were full and good and demanding, and she loved them. One evening in the winter of 1889, she and Ralph were sitting by the stove after the children were asleep, she with a document repair on her lap and he reading the county newspaper. And she looked up from her work and found him watching her with the storm-gray eyes and the expression that still, after 7 years, caught her off guard in the way that good things catch you off guard, not because they are surprising but because they remain genuinely moving. "What?" she said. "Nothing," he said. "Just watching you work." "You have seen me work approximately 10,000 times," she said. "Every time is interesting," he said. She looked at him for a moment, this man who had ridden 40 miles in the dark to get her to a courtroom in time, who had stood watch in a cold alley while she worked by lamplight on a county record book, who had held her mother's restored wedding dress with careful hands and brought it to her and changed everything. This man who had looked at her repaired deed and found the language insufficient and said extraordinary and meant it absolutely. "Ralph," she said. "Olive," he said. "I am happy," she said plainly in the way she said everything that was true and important. He set down the newspaper. "So am I," he said. "Remarkably so." She went back to her work, and he went back to his reading, and the stove was warm and the children were asleep in their beds, and the prairie wind moved over the shortgrass outside and across the 160 acres that were hers, that had always been hers, that would remain hers. The creek running cold in the northeastern corner through the long, dark Kansas winter, and all of it real, all of it earned, all of it held. In the spring of 1890, she filed the completed documentation for the 6th annual renewal of the Baker claim, the last such renewal required under the Homestead Act provisions before full fee-simple title transferred permanently. Harriet Branch at the land office processed it with the efficiency of a woman who ran a tight operation, and 2 weeks later Olive received her final title certificate in the post. She held it for a moment at the kitchen table, feeling its weight, which was not the weight of paper but the weight of 11 years and 40 miles, and a torn deed, and 10 nights by lamplight and a February morning, when a man had come to her door with his mother's ruined dress, and changed the whole direction of her life without either of them knowing it yet. Then she carried it to the iron box and added it to the collection of documents inside, the receipts and the survey reports and the legal filings and the copies and the originals, the complete record of a life built one careful, precise, unintimidated act at a time. She closed the box and went to find her husband, because it was a good morning and there was work to do and the spring was already warm, and their son James was turning 6 in September, and Clara was walking confidently and getting into everything she could reach, and the Double D's spring count had come in strong, and the seamstress work had 3 commissions waiting, and the creek in the northeastern corner was running clear and cold, and none of it had been given to her, and all of it was hers. She found Ralph in the barn and she told him about the title certificate, and he looked at her with those eyes for a moment, and then he smiled, the full open smile that still changed his face entirely, and he said, "It was always going to be yours." "I know," she said. He pulled her close and she went willingly, which she had always done willingly and freely, because freedom is not the absence of choosing. It is the ability to choose what you actually want. And what she wanted was this. This man, this land, this life, built with her own hands and her own mind and her own needle and thread, repaired wherever it tore, held together wherever it pulled apart, continuing. She pressed her face against his shoulder in the warm barn with the horses shifting in their stalls and the spring light coming in gold through the open door, and she thought about the word her work had always been built around, the word she had first understood when she was 15 and repairing a damaged letter for a woman who needed the words on it to be real again. Restoration. To bring back what was whole. To take the torn and the damaged and the cut-through and the broken, and with patience and skill, and the refusal to accept that damaged is the same as destroyed, to make it whole again. She had done it for documents and garments and maps and a wedding dress and a land deed. She had done it for herself, for the 4 years before he came, when she had restored her own independence and her own capability, and her own life from the raw material of what she had brought to Kansas with her. And she had done it, she understood now, standing in the warm spring barn with her husband's arms around her, for this as well, for the life they were building, which would tear sometimes and be damaged sometimes and would require the same patience and skill and refusal, but which was fundamentally sound, fundamentally real, and which would hold. Outside, James called from somewhere near the house, the high, carrying call of a 6-year-old with important news or a pressing need, or simply the desire to know that someone was there. Clara's voice answered him from nearer, her new words clear and certain. Ralph released her, and she straightened her apron, and they walked out of the barn together into the Kansas spring morning, to their children and their land and their continuing life, and the creek ran on in the northeastern corner, cold and clear, and everything that mattered was exactly where it was supposed to be.